better part of an hour, and nobody had bothered to feed it. Hazel noticed because she always noticed things others ignored. The way the rushes on the floor had gone gray with mud and needed changing. The way the tallow candles burned crooked when the draft came through the gap beneath the tavern door. The way old Marin in the corner had been nursing the same cup of watered-down mead since midday, because she could not afford another. Hazel noticed all of it. And then, quietly, without drawing attention to herself, she fixed what she could. She added 2 logs to the fire. She straightened the candles. She refilled Marin's cup without being asked, and waved off the coin the old woman tried to press into her palm. "Keep it," Hazel said softly. Marin smiled with the few teeth she had left, and Hazel moved on. The Tavern of the Red Antler sat at the edge of the village of Ashfin, a small and unremarkable settlement, 2 days' ride from the royal capital of Dawnmere. The building itself was low-ceilinged and timber-framed, its walls dark with decades of smoke, its floors uneven from the shifting of old foundations. In winter, wind crept through every crack. The smell was always the same: roasted meat, spilled ale, wet wool, and the particular earthiness of people who had worked hard and traveled far. Hazel had worked here for 3 years. She was 24, with dark auburn hair she kept pinned beneath a linen cloth when she served, and eyes the color of hazelnuts, which was, as it happened, exactly why the tavern keeper, Aldrich, had hired her. "You look honest," he had said, squinting at her across the bar on the day she arrived, with nothing but a worn satchel, and a quiet desperation she had tried very hard to hide. People trust honest faces. She had been grateful for that. She had been grateful for a great many small things since the world had taken away the larger ones. Tonight, the tavern was fuller than usual. Word had spread through Ashfin like smoke through a keyhole. The king's procession had stopped at the village to rest before the final leg of its journey north. Royal outriders had arrived at midday, stone-faced and silent, and by evening the main road through the village was lined with torches, and the distant sound of hoofbeats had shaken the very ground beneath Hazel's feet as she carried a tray of bowls across the common room. She had not gone to watch. There was work to be done, and besides, kings did not interest her. Kings meant soldiers, soldiers meant demands, and demands meant that someone like Hazel, quiet, careful, occupying no more space than necessary, would end up working twice as hard for half the thanks. She was carrying a stack of wooden platters toward the kitchen when the door of the Red Antler opened. The cold came in first, a blade of November air that made every flame in the room shudder. Then came the guards, 4 of them, broad and armored in dark leather studded with iron, wolf insignias pressed into their pauldrons. They said nothing. They did not need to. The room simply changed when they entered it, the way a forest changes when a predator steps into the clearing. Conversations dropped. Cups were set down. Even Aldrich behind the bar went very still, and then he walked in. Hazel told herself later that she had not stared. She had simply paused, just for a moment. He was taller than the doorframe nearly demanded, forced to tilt his head slightly as he entered. His hair was dark, close-cropped at the sides and longer at the crown, and his eyes, when they swept the room, were a pale and disconcerting shade of gray, the color of winter sky just before snow. He wore a traveling cloak of deep charcoal wool lined with black fur, road-dusted but still carrying the unmistakable weight of authority. There was a scar along his left jaw, a clean diagonal line that might have been a blade or a claw, and his face held the particular stillness of a man who had long ago stopped explaining himself to anyone. King Cassian of Dawnmere. She recognized him from the royal seal she'd seen stamped on proclamations nailed to the village post. She had never expected to stand 12 feet from him in a smoky tavern in Ashfin. He did not look at her. He looked at Aldrich, and Aldrich nearly fell over himself. "Your Majesty, the Red Antler is honored. Please, I can have the private room cleared at once." "No need." Cassian's voice was low and unhurried, the kind that did not rise to fill a room, and yet somehow reached every corner of it. We stop for 1 hour. My mother requires warmth and something to eat. That is all. His mother. Hazel's gaze moved almost involuntarily to the figure who had entered behind him. She had missed her completely. The woman was small, wrapped in a heavy cloak of deep green wool edged with gray fur, her silver hair pulled back beneath a velvet hood. She moved slowly, one hand resting on the arm of a young attendant, and her face, when she lowered her hood, was lined and pale and held a kind of composed dignity that reminded Hazel, with a sudden ache, of her own grandmother. The woman's eyes moved around the room. Not the way a queen's eyes moved, cataloging threats and exits, more like the way a person moves through the world when they have learned to pay very close attention to everything, because sound will not carry the information to them. Hazel understood immediately. She had known one other person who moved through the world that way. Her grandmother, Edna, had lost most of her hearing by the time Hazel was 7. And Hazel, who had adored her grandmother with the whole of her small and serious heart, had spent years learning to speak with her hands. The old signs. The ones her grandmother had taught her, patient and precise, forming shapes in the air the way other women formed letters on parchment. She was still holding the stack of wooden platters. She set them down on the nearest table, quietly, and she watched. The attendant was trying to guide the older woman toward a seat near the fire, but something had gone wrong. The woman, the Queen Mother, Hazel understood now, had stopped moving and was looking at the bench with an expression of polite resistance. The bench was low and backless, pushed up against the wall beside a table still cluttered with the remnants of someone else's supper. Dirty cups. A knife left carelessly close to the edge. A puddle of spilled ale that had not yet been wiped. No one else in the room seemed to notice the problem. Or if they did not know what to do about it. Hazel moved before she had made any conscious decision to do so. She crossed the room, picked up the dirty cups and the knife, swept the spilled ale with the cloth she kept tucked at her apron strings, and then, in one smooth motion, slid a high-backed chair away from Aldrich's private table near the hearth, and positioned it in the warmest corner of the room, close enough to the fire to feel it, far enough not to be overwhelmed by smoke. Then she turned to the Queen Mother, and she raised her hands. The signs were old. She was not certain, even as she formed them, that they would be recognized. Her grandmother had learned them from her own mother, and that was a generation and more removed from wherever this woman had learned hers. But the shapes were universal enough in their roots. Warm, seat, rest. The Queen Mother went very still. For a moment, the entire tavern seemed to hold its breath. Hazel was aware, distantly, that Cassian had turned to look at her. She was aware of the weight of his gaze, the way one is aware of standing too close to the edge of a high place. A physical pressure, a pull of gravity. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the older woman, and then the Queen Mother smiled. It was not a polite smile. It was not the composed, careful expression she had worn since entering the room. It was something that broke through all of that. Sudden and warm and a little wondering, the way a person smiles when they have not expected to be seen, and then, unexpectedly, they are. She answered. Her hands moved, slower than Hazel's grandmother's had, more deliberate, as though she was not certain this young woman would understand. But the signs were clear enough. You know the old language. Hazel's chest tightened. She answered, My grandmother taught me. The Queen Mother looked at her for a long moment. Then she moved toward the chair Hazel had prepared, and she sat, and she let out a slow breath that seemed to carry something heavier than tiredness in it, something like relief. Hazel turned to go back to her work. She nearly walked directly into Cassian. He was closer than she had realized, close enough that she could see the road dust still caught in the fur of his cloak, close enough to notice that the pale gray of his eyes was not entirely uniform, that there were darker rings at the edges like storm clouds at a horizon. He was looking at her with an expression she could not read. Not the flat authority he had worn when he'd spoken to Aldrich. Not the carefully maintained stillness she had observed from across the room. Something else. Something that had not quite settled into any recognizable shape yet. "Where did you learn that?" he said. His voice was quiet. Quieter than it had been before. Hazel held her tray to her chest like a shield she was pretending not to need. "From my grandmother, my lord," she said. She could not hear either in her later years. "I learned to speak with her." He said nothing for a moment, just looked at her. "What is your name?" "Hazel, my lord." Another silence. Behind him, she could see his mother watching them both with an expression that was carefully, entirely neutral. But her hands, resting in her lap, had curled slightly inward, and Hazel had spent enough years reading what hands said to know that even that small gesture meant something. "Hazel," Cassian repeated, as though the word was a question he hadn't finished asking yet. And then one of his guards stepped forward and murmured something low into his ear, and whatever had opened in his expression closed again, like a shutter pulled against the wind, and he turned away. Hazel exhaled slowly. She went back to her work. She refilled cups and cleared plates and added another log to the fire and tried, very deliberately, not to think about the way he had said her name. She failed, mostly. It was near the end of the hour when the trouble started. The man's name was Corvin, and he had been drinking since before sundown. Hazel knew the type. She had learned to recognize them the way a sailor learns to read the sky. Not because the knowledge was pleasant, but because it was necessary. Corvin was a minor lord steward from the next village over, a man who wore his small authority like an ill-fitting coat and grew louder and larger with every cup. She had been watching him from the corner of her eye for the better part of an hour, the way she watched the fire when the wind shifted, waiting to see which direction the trouble would fall. It fell toward the Queen Mother. He had not recognized her at first. That much was clear. He had simply seen an old woman sitting alone in the best chair by the fire, attended by a single young servant girl, and something in him had decided that was an arrangement he objected to. "That seat," he announced to no one in particular, pushing himself upright from his bench with the careful overcorrection of the genuinely drunk, "is the finest in this establishment." Hazel was already moving. She crossed the room with a full tray balanced in both hands, inserting herself smoothly between Corvin and the Queen Mother's corner, and offered him her most professionally empty smile. "I can find you a very comfortable seat near the window, my lord," she said. "The draft has settled this evening. You'd have more room to—" "I didn't speak to you, girl." The words landed flat and dismissive, the way stones land in shallow water. Hazel did not flinch. She had been called worse, by men less drunk, and she had learned that flinching only encouraged them. "Of course," she said pleasantly. "All the same, the lady has been traveling and is quite tired. Perhaps—" "The lady," Corvin said, his eyes sliding past Hazel to the silver-haired woman in the green cloak, "can find herself another seat. She doesn't even respond when spoken to. Deaf or simple or both." The word landed in the room like a coal dropped on dry rushes. Hazel felt the temperature of the air change, not from the hearth, from behind her. She turned slightly, just enough to see. Cassian had come through the back passage. He had been speaking with Aldrich in the corridor, she thought, or perhaps with his men, and he had gone very still in the doorway. His eyes were on Corvin. His expression had not changed, and somehow that was worse than if it had. Hazel turned back to Corvin. "The lady," she said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended, but steadier, "is a guest of this establishment and has done nothing to trouble you. I'd ask you kindly to return to your seat." Corvin's gaze dropped to her, and something in it shifted. the particular ugly recalibration of a man deciding that if he could not intimidate one target, he would redirect himself toward a smaller one. "You have a great deal of nerve," he said, "for a tavern girl." "I've been told," Hazel said. She kept her eyes on his. She kept her hands steady on the tray. She was aware, in the periphery of her vision, that the room had gone the particular quality of silent that meant everyone was watching and no one intended to intervene. She was also aware that the Queen Mother had straightened in her chair and was watching the scene with an expression that had moved from composed to something sharper. And she was aware, with a clarity that prickled the back of her neck, that Cassian had not moved from the doorway. He was watching. Not the way he had watched before, that quiet, unreadable appraisal. This was something different. This was the stillness of a man deciding whether to let a situation resolve itself or to end it. Corvin reached out and took hold of the edge of Hazel's tray. "Move," he said. Hazel did not move. Later she would not be entirely sure why. Survival instinct said to step aside, to let the drunk man have whatever small victory would satisfy him and send him back to his bench. 3 years of working the Red Antler had taught her that particular arithmetic of survival. Give a little, lose nothing that matters, keep the peace. But the Queen Mother was behind her. And something about the look on that woman's face, not fear, nothing so simple as fear, but the particular resigned composure of someone who had long ago accepted that the world would not always make room for them. Something about that undid the arithmetic entirely. "No," Hazel said. The word came out very calm. Even she was a little surprised. Corvin's expression darkened. He pulled the tray. Not hard, just enough to throw her balance, and Hazel stumbled 1 step sideways, and the tray tilted, and the cups on it slid, and would have gone to the floor if a hand had not appeared from beside her and caught the tray before it could fall. Not her hand. A larger one. Dark leather glove, iron ring on the 3rd finger bearing the wolf crest of Dawnmere. Cassian set the tray upright on the nearest table. He did it without looking at it. He was looking at Corvin. The silence in the room had gone from the watching kind to the holding breath kind. Corvin went the color of old ash. Whatever ale-soaked confidence had been propping him upright seemed to drain out through the soles of his boots. His mouth opened. Closed. He started. "You will leave this establishment," Cassian said. His voice had not risen at all. It was, if anything, quieter than it had been before, and somehow that made it carry further. "You will do so now, and you will not return tonight. And you will spend whatever time remains before dawn considering the difference between a woman who cannot hear and a woman who deserves contempt, because I assure you, they are not the same thing." Corvin left. He knocked over his bench getting to the door, and no one laughed, and he did not look back. The room breathed again. Hazel realized her hands were shaking slightly. She pressed them flat against her apron and looked up at Cassian, who was still standing beside her, closer than was entirely comfortable, close enough that she could see the slight tension in his jaw, the way his hands had not quite uncurled from where they'd been clenched at his sides. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. "You didn't need me." It was not a compliment exactly. It was more like an observation, delivered with the same careful neutrality he seemed to apply to everything. But something in it sat differently than she expected. "I might have worn a great deal of ale," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something smaller and less practiced than a smile, as though the expression was slightly unfamiliar to the muscles involved. "Hazel." It was the Queen Mother. She had risen from her chair, slowly, with the careful movement of someone whose joints protested cold weather, and she had crossed the small distance between them, and now she stood before Hazel with her hands raised. "Come," she signed. "Sit with me." Hazel looked at her, startled. "My lady, I have work," The Queen Mother's hands moved again, a small, firm repetition. "Sit with me." Hazel glanced at Aldrich, who was behind the bar watching with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Something between bewilderment and something almost like respect. He gave a small, stunned nod. Hazel sat. The chair the Queen Mother indicated was close to the fire, across from her own. It was a low, plain thing, a servant's chair. But the warmth was real, and the Queen Mother settled across from her with a small exhale and looked at her with the same quiet attention she had used to survey the room when she first arrived. Her name, she signed, was Seraphine. Hazel answered, "I am Hazel." "I know," Seraphine signed, and there was something warm and slightly amused in it. "My son said it twice." Hazel felt her cheeks warm. She was grateful for the firelight. They talked, in the way of signs and patient repetition and occasional misunderstanding corrected gently on both sides, about small things at first, the cold of the road north, the particular misery of traveling in November, the quality of the fire. Seraphine asked how long Hazel had worked at the Red Antler, and Hazel told her 3 years, and Seraphine's expression shifted in a way that asked a question she did not put into signs yet. Hazel answered it anyway. "Before that, I was elsewhere. Things changed." Seraphine looked at her. Her hands moved very carefully, as though choosing each sign with the same consideration a person gives to words they mean to carry weight. Things change for everyone. The question is what you carry forward. Hazel sat with that for a moment. "What do you carry?" she asked. It was perhaps too direct a question to ask the mother of a king. But Seraphine did not seem offended. She looked into the fire for a moment, and then she looked back at Hazel, and her hands formed something that Hazel had to read twice to be sure she had understood it correctly. Everything he cannot show the world. That is a mother's work. Hazel followed the older woman's gaze, almost involuntarily, to where Cassian stood near the door with 2 of his guard, head slightly inclined, listening to something one of them was reporting in a low voice. His profile was sharp against the candlelight. His hands, she noticed, were clasped behind his back, and his left thumb was moving in a slow, repeating arc across his right knuckle. A small private gesture of something he was working to contain. She looked away. Seraphine was watching her watch him. Her expression was entirely, infuriatingly neutral. Hazel cleared her throat. "Can I bring you something to eat, my lady?" Seraphine's eyes held a glint of something that might, in another woman, have been called mischief. "Yes," she signed. "And then come back. I have more questions." It was when Hazel rose to go to the kitchen that she passed close enough to 2 of the royal guards to hear what they were saying, low-voiced, not meant for her, the kind of conversation men have when they assume a serving girl is furniture. "Can't stay the night. Orders are orders. We move before dawn." "In this cold? The road north past the Greywood is not—" "The Alpha King does not adjust his plans because a road is difficult. It's not the road I'm worried about. There are reports of movement in the Greywood. Raiders. The advance scouts haven't returned." A pause. "He knows?" "He knows. He's going anyway." Hazel walked past them into the kitchen. She set her tray down on the preparation table, and she stood there for a moment with her hands pressed flat against the worn wood. And she thought about missing scouts and a road through a dark forest, and a king who did not adjust his plans for difficult things. And then she thought about a silver-haired woman in a green cloak, who carried everything her son could not show the world. She began to prepare the food. Her hands were not entirely steady. The kitchen of the Red Antler was the one place in the tavern where Hazel allowed herself to think. Out in the common room there was always something demanding her attention. A cup to refill, a table to clear, a dispute to quietly redirect before it became Aldrich's problem. But the kitchen was different. The kitchen had a rhythm of its own, steady and uncomplicated, and within it Her hands could move on their own, while her mind went wherever it needed to go. Tonight, it went north, to the Greywood. She had grown up on the edge of that forest. Before everything changed, before the years that she did not speak about in taverns or anywhere else. She had lived in a village called Ember's Crossing, that sat at the southern mouth of the Greywood like a child standing at the entrance to something far larger than itself. She knew those trees. She knew the way the pines grew so dense that midday looked like dusk inside them. The way the cold came down from the high ridges and settled into the hollows like something living. The way sound traveled strangely in there, muffled in some places, impossibly clear in others. She also knew that when men who were trained to navigate that forest did not come back, it meant something had gone very wrong inside it. She plated the food with more care than the situation strictly required. Warm bread, a bowl of thick pottage with root vegetables, a wedge of hard cheese, a cup of heated cider with cloves. Things that would sustain someone who had been traveling in the cold. She carried the tray back out to the common room and set it before Seraphine, who accepted it with a small nod and immediately offered Hazel the bread. Hazel blinked. "My lady, that's for—" "You haven't eaten," Seraphine signed. It was not a question. Hazel opened her mouth to argue and found she had nothing convincing to offer. She had, in fact, not eaten since a handful of oats that morning. There had simply not been time, and the habit of eating last, or not at all, was one she had developed so gradually she rarely noticed it anymore. She took the bread. She sat. She ate a few bites and found, unexpectedly, that her eyes were stinging. She blinked it away before it became anything embarrassing. Seraphine watched her with the particular patience of a woman who had learned to read everything that sound could not carry. The set of a jaw, the angle of a shoulder, the way a person's hands moved differently when they were holding something back. Hazel felt, under that gaze, very slightly transparent. "How long?" Seraphine signed slowly. "Have you been alone?" Hazel looked at her. "That is a very direct question, my lady." "I am old," Seraphine answered, and there was something dry and warm in it. "I have run out of patience for the indirect kind." Despite everything, Hazel almost smiled. 3 years, she said. More or less. Family? Gone. She kept her voice even. My grandmother first, then my mother. My father left long before that. I don't remember him clearly. She paused. I had a brother. He was younger. She stopped. He's gone too. Seraphine was quiet for a moment. Then her hands moved carefully. I'm sorry. Loss like that leaves a mark that does not fade. It only becomes part of the shape of you. Hazel pressed her lips together. She nodded once, not trusting her voice to stay as steady as she needed it to be. It was at that moment that Cassian appeared at the edge of her vision. He had finished whatever conversation he'd been having with his guards, and now he stood a few feet from his mother's chair, looking at the two of them with an expression that was, for just a moment before he composed it, something she might have called startled, as though he had expected to find his mother waiting in polite and tolerant silence, and had instead found her deep in conversation with a tavern girl over shared bread. Seraphine looked up at her son. Her hands moved. Sit down, Cassian. You're looming. Something passed across his face that was, Hazel thought, the closest thing to embarrassment she was likely to ever see on it. He sat, not in the chair beside his mother, but on the bench across from Hazel, which put him directly in her line of sight and made the already small corner feel considerably smaller. She looked at her bread. She has been telling you things, Cassian said. It was addressed to Hazel, and it was not quite an accusation, but it was in the vicinity. Your mother has been asking me things, Hazel corrected, keeping her voice mild. That's different. He looked at her steadily. What has she asked? Things that are between her and me, my lord. A pause. I see. Seraphine signed something that she aimed very deliberately at her son, with the particular precision of a woman who knows she is being understood perfectly well. Hazel caught only part of it. The signs Seraphine used were occasionally different from what Hazel's grandmother had taught her. Regional variations, perhaps, or simply age. But she caught enough. Something about being afraid of a girl with bread. Hazel looked very intently at the fire. Cassian said, in a voice that suggested he had decided to change the subject entirely, "You were not afraid of that man earlier." "Corvin?" Hazel considered. "I was a little afraid. I'm not made of stone." "You didn't show it." "Showing it would have made it worse." She paused. "I've learned that." He was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled and settled, throwing a shift of light across the planes of his face. Up close, the scar along his jaw was more visible. Not rough, not the ragged mark of a bad wound poorly healed, but clean, the kind that came from a precise and deliberate blade. "You said your grandmother taught you the hand language," he said. "Yes." "She was born unable to hear, or did she lose it later?" "Later. Slowly, over years. She said it was like a tide going out." Hazel glanced at Seraphine, then back. "Is it the same for—" "Yes." He said it simply, without the stiffness she might have expected around the subject. "She was not born this way. There was an illness when I was 12. It took her hearing almost entirely over the course of a year." Hazel thought about that. A 12-year-old boy, watching his mother lose something so fundamental. Learning. Gradually, that the world she had navigated by sound would have to be relearned entirely. And wondering, perhaps, whether she would find her way through it. "She found her way through it," Hazel said, without quite meaning to say it aloud. Cassian looked at her. "Yes," he said after a moment. "She did." Seraphine, who had been following the conversation with the attention of someone reading lips, raised her hands and signed something at her son. Cassian's jaw tightened slightly. "She's asking me to tell you that I also learned the hand language," he said, "so that we could speak." Hazel looked at Seraphine. "Then why haven't you been using it with her all evening?" "Because," he said, "it is one thing to speak with your mother in private. It is another to—" He stopped. "To let people see," Hazel finished. He did not answer. He did not need to. She looked at him for a moment. The composed face, the careful stillness, the slight tension around his eyes that she was beginning to recognize as something he wore like armor. And she thought about what Seraphine had signed to her earlier. Everything he cannot show the world. That is a mother's work. She thought about what it cost to be the person everyone expected to be without fracture. "My grandmother used to say," Hazel said quietly, "that the loneliest thing in the world is not being unable to speak. It's being surrounded by people who don't try to listen." Seraphine's hands moved immediately, without hesitation. "Yes, exactly that." Cassian looked at his mother. Then he looked at Hazel. And then, very slowly, he raised his hands. The signs he formed were careful and slightly stiff, the way a language is when it's been practiced in private, rather than spoken freely. But they were clear. They were correct. They were directed at his mother, and what they said was simply, "I should have done this more." Seraphine looked at her son for a long moment, with an expression that Hazel could not bear to watch directly, because it was too much. Too much love and too much old sorrow and too much of something that had been waiting a very long time to be said. She looked away at the fire and gave them a moment that wasn't hers. The hour ended. Cassian rose first, and the ease of the corner by the fire, that strange, brief interval that had felt almost separate from the rest of the world, dissolved back into formality and purpose. The guards repositioned themselves. The attendant reappeared at Seraphine's side. The cold that the door let in when one of the outriders entered to report brought with it the smell of horses and night air, and the particular sharpness of a world that did not pause for small, warm moments. Hazel rose too, collecting the empty bowl and cup onto her tray, resuming the shape of herself that belonged to this place. Seraphine caught her hand before she could step away. The older woman looked up at her, and her hands formed something slow and deliberate. "You said your brother is gone. How do you know?" Hazel stilled. It was such a precise question. Not "I'm sorry" or "that must be hard," but the direct, careful question of a woman who listened to what was said and equally to what was not. We were separated," Hazel said. Her voice had gone quieter. "During difficult times. I was told he didn't survive." Told by whom? Hazel opened her mouth, closed it. She had never, in 3 years, let herself pull that question all the way out into the light. It lived in her chest like a splinter she had learned to breathe around. The question of who had told her, and why, and whether they had any reason to tell the truth. "I don't know," she said, and the words cost more than she'd expected. Seraphine held her gaze for a moment longer. Then she released her hand, and her expression settled back into its composed quiet. But something in her eyes remained. A kind of deliberate attention. The look of a woman filing something away. Hazel stepped back. She pressed her free hand against her apron and breathed. At the door, Cassian paused. He had not been close enough to read the signs, she thought. Or perhaps he had been deliberately giving them distance. But he turned, and for a moment his eyes found hers across the warm and smoky length of the room. And the look on his face was the same unsettled, unfinished thing it had been the first time. A question he had not yet decided whether to ask. Then he turned and walked out into the dark, and his men followed, and the door closed, and the cold retreated. The red antler breathed out. Hazel stood in the middle of the common room with her tray and her question, and the ghost of a silver-haired woman's hands still moving in the air before her eyes. Told by whom? She did not sleep well that night. What she did not know, what she could not have seen from the common room, was that outside, in the dark, one of Cassian's guards had pressed a folded piece of parchment into his hand. Cassian had read it in the torchlight beside his horse, his expression unmoving. Then he had looked back at the tavern, at the warm light in its small windows, at the outline of a girl carrying a tray inside, and he had folded the parchment again and held it for a long moment before giving a single order. "Find out about a village called Ember's Crossing," he said, "and find out what happened to a family there. 3 years ago." His captain gave him a long look. "My lord, the road north." "I know the road," Cassian said. "Do it anyway." The Greywood at night was a different world entirely. Cassian had ridden through it before, in daylight, when the pine canopy filtered the sun into long, pale columns, and the forest had the quality of a cathedral, vast and silent, and indifferent to human concerns. He had not ridden through it in November, in the dark, with 4 missing scouts and a report of raider movement that his captain kept trying to discuss, and he kept filing away to consider later. Later being a concept that felt increasingly abstract. The procession moved in tight formation, his personal guard flanking his mother's covered litter, outriders ahead and behind with torches that did almost nothing against the particular density of the dark between the trees. The pines here were old, their trunks wider than 3 men standing with arms outstretched, their roots breaking through the frozen earth like the knuckles of buried giants. The cold was absolute. It pressed through leather and wool and fur alike, the kind of cold that found every gap and settled there, patient and thorough. Cassian rode at the front. He told himself it was tactical. He told himself it was because he needed to see what the outriders saw, to make decisions quickly, if the situation required them. He did not examine the other thing. the restlessness that had been sitting in his chest since he walked out of the Red Antler, the way his mind kept returning to a corner near a fire, and a girl who had not flinched when a drunk man grabbed her tray. "You didn't need me." He had meant it as an observation. He had not expected it to come out sounding like something else. "My lord." His captain, Drev, appeared at his left flank, a broad, weathered man of 50, who had served Cassian's father before him and had the particular talent of delivering bad news in a voice that suggested it was merely mildly inconvenient. "The advance outriders have returned," Drev said. Cassian looked at him. "All 4? 2. The other 2. A pause. "We found signs of a struggle. 2 miles north, where the road bends past the old ridge. Raiders." "Not raiders." Drev's voice dropped a note. "Tracks. Large ones. Not human." Cassian was quiet for a moment. Around them, the forest pressed close, and the torches streamed sideways in a wind that had come from nowhere, carrying the smell of pine resin and something underneath it, something darker and earthier that he recognized without wanting to. "How many?" he said. "Difficult to say. The ground is frozen hard. But my lord—" Drev hesitated. "The tracks are fresh. Whatever made them passed through here within the last hour." Cassian pulled his horse to a halt. He turned and looked back at the litter that carried his mother. The green curtains drawn against the cold, the 2 attendants riding close on either side, the 6 guards surrounding it in a formation he had specified himself before they left Ashfen. He had brought her on this journey because she had asked. She rarely asked for things. She had long ago accepted that the world required her to accommodate it rather than the reverse, and she bore that accommodation with a composure that made him feel sometimes that he had failed some fundamental duty he could not quite name. When she had signed to him 3 weeks ago, "I want to see the northern shrine before winter closes the roads," he had said yes before he'd finished reading the signs. He had not anticipated the Greywood being anything other than cold and unpleasant. "Tighten the formation around the litter," he said to Drev. "Double the rear guard. And tell the men, quietly without alarming the attendants, to have weapons ready." Drev nodded once and pulled away. Cassian turned back to the road ahead and sat very still in the saddle for a moment, listening. The forest was doing what it always did, breathing in its own slow way, the creak of branches, the distant crack of frozen wood, the wind moving through the canopy far above like a tide. And beneath all of it, barely at the edge of perception, something that was not wind and not branch and not any sound that belonged to winter trees. He urged his horse forward. They were a mile further north when the attack came. It came from the east side of the road, from the dense shadow between 2 massive pine trunks, and it came fast, faster than anything that large should have been able to move. 3 of them, enormous dark shapes bursting from the tree line with the force of a collapsed wall, and the outriders at the front barely had time to cry out before the formation shattered. Cassian was already moving. He did not think. There was no space for thought between the sound and the motion. His body simply responded, the way it had been trained to respond since he was 14, and his father had first handed him a sword, and said hesitation is a luxury the dead can afford. He wheeled his horse, drew his blade, and put himself between the attack and his mother's litter. The creatures, and they were unmistakably creatures, not men, not wolves, something in the gray space between, were enormous. Taller than horses at the shoulder, moving on 4 limbs with an intelligence in their eyes that made them more frightening rather than less. The forest around them had gone entirely silent, the way a forest goes silent when the thing at the top of the food chain moves through it. His guard engaged. There was the crash of weapons, the screaming of horses, the particular controlled chaos of trained men, fighting something they had trained against in the abstract, but never quite in the specific. Drev was shouting orders. Torches fell and guttered, and 2 of them went out, throwing a section of the road into near total darkness. Cassian fought. He was good at it. He had never found satisfaction in it. That was something he had learned distinguished him from certain other men. Men who came alive in violence the way others came alive in music or prayer. For Cassian, it was simply a thing to be done correctly, like any other duty, and so he did it correctly, measured, efficient, without the kind of fury that made men careless. He cut. He drove back. He put his horse between one of the creatures and the litter and held the ground until two of his guard could flank it and force it back into the trees. It lasted perhaps 10 minutes. It felt longer. When it was over, when the remaining creature had retreated into the dark, and the forest had gone silent again, and the men were breathing hard and assessing their wounds by torchlight, Cassian dismounted and went immediately to his mother's litter. He pulled the curtain back. Seraphine was sitting upright, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed in that particular way she had of composing it. Her attendant beside her had both hands pressed to her mouth and was shaking visibly. His mother was not shaking. She was watching him with dark, steady eyes, and the first thing she did when she saw his face was raise one hand and form a single sign. "I'm unhurt." He let out a breath he had not known he was holding. He reached in and took her hand, which was cold even through her glove, and held it for a moment without signing anything. She looked at his arm. He had not noticed, had not had time to notice, the line of blood on his left forearm where one of the creatures had caught him. The leather was torn. It was not deep. He would not have given it a second thought except that his mother's eyes had fixed on it with an expression that no amount of composure could entirely contain. He signed with his free hand. "It's nothing." She signed back. "It is not nothing. It is my son's arm." He almost said something. Instead, he closed the curtain gently and turned back to Drev, who was waiting with the particular expression of a man who had 3 urgent things to say and had ranked them by severity. "The men?" Cassian said. 2 injured, none gravely. The outrider at the front took a blow to the shoulder. He'll ride, but not fight. Drev paused. "My lord, I must advise. We continue north. The road—" "I know the road, Drev." He was already walking toward his horse. "Post archers on both flanks. Close the formation. We move faster." Drev was quiet for a moment. "Is it wise, my lord, to continue with the Queen Mother?" "She asked to go north," Cassian said. "She is going north." It came out more sharply than he intended. Drev said nothing, which was, Hazel might have noted had she been there to observe it, the same kind of diplomatic silence she herself employed when dealing with difficult people. Cassian mounted. He looked back at the litter. He looked at the road ahead. He thought, with a clarity that had no business arriving in the middle of a dark forest after a fight, about a girl who had said showing fear would have made it worse. "I've learned that." He thought about what it meant, to have learned that. What specific sequence of events arranged themselves into that particular education? Find out about a village called Ember's Crossing, he had told his captain, before they left Ashvin, 3 years ago. The report had not yet come, but Drev had a long reach, and there were messengers who could move faster than a royal procession, and Cassian was a patient man, mostly. 3 days north, in the walled town of Karenfeld, where the northern shrine stood at the center of a small stone courtyard, Seraphine lit her candle and said whatever she said in the quiet of her own interior, and Cassian stood at the courtyard entrance and watched her and thought about things he had not thought about in a long time. He thought about duty and what it cost. He thought about the year his mother lost her hearing, the long months of her sitting at dinner tables where people spoke around her without turning to include her, the way she had gradually begun to disappear from rooms she had once filled with her voice, the way he had watched it happen and been 12 years old and known, with the helpless fury of a child, that he was not yet large enough to stop it. He had learned the hand language in secret at first. A traveling scholar his father had employed for Cassian's education had known a version of it, and Cassian had spent 6 months learning in the evenings after his lessons were done, and then one morning at breakfast he had signed to his mother across the table. Something simple. "Good morning. How did you sleep?" And she had gone so still that everyone at the table had noticed. She had signed back. Her hands had been shaking. He had not let anyone see him use it since. Not because he was ashamed. He was not ashamed. But because the world had opinions about a king who communicated with his hands, and the world's opinions had a way of becoming his mother's burden, and he had decided, at 12, that he would not add to that burden. He had been adding to it differently, he understood now, by keeping her invisible in a different way. "I should have done this more," he had signed to her, in the corner of the Red Antler, in front of a tavern girl with bread in her hand, and too much understanding in her eyes. He had meant it. The candle in the shrine courtyard burned small and steady against the December wind. His mother's silver head was bowed. Around the walls, his guards maintained their posts with the discipline of men who had just survived something and were not yet certain the surviving was over. Drev appeared at his elbow. "The report came, my lord," he said quietly. "About Ember's Crossing." Cassian looked at him. Drev's face was doing something careful, something that meant the information was not simple and not good and would require decisions. "Tell me," Cassian said, and Drev told him. By the time he finished, the candle in the shrine had burned a third of the way down, and Cassian was looking at it without seeing it, and the expression on his face was the one that his men had learned, over years of service, to be very still around. Not anger. Anger was too simple a word for it. Resolve. The particular, quiet, absolute resolve of a man who had just identified something that needed to be fixed and intended to fix it. "Send a rider back to Ashvin," he said. "Tonight." Drev nodded. "And the message?" Cassian was quiet for a moment. "Tell her," he said, "that her brother is alive." The rider arrived at the Red Antler on the 4th morning after the procession had left Ashvin. Hazel was sweeping the front step when the horse appeared at the end of the village road. A single rider moving fast, wearing the wolf crest of Dawnmere on his chest. She watched him approach with the mild curiosity of someone who had learned not to invest too much feeling in things that were not yet certain. Royal riders passed through Ashvin occasionally. It rarely had anything to do with her. He pulled his horse to a stop directly in front of her. "I am looking for a woman called Hazel," he said. "She works here." She held the broom handle with both hands. "You've found her." He reached into his saddlebag and produced a folded piece of parchment, sealed with dark wax pressed with the wolf crest. He held it out. She took it. "I was told to wait for your answer," he said. She broke the seal. The handwriting inside was precise and unhurried, the same quality she had observed in the man himself. Nothing wasted, nothing performed. "Your brother's name is Owen. He is alive. He has been in the village of Thornwall, north of the Greywood, for 2 years, taken in by a healer's family after he was found injured on the road. He does not know where you are. He has been looking. If you are willing to come north, I will send an escort. You will not be obligated to remain. You will not be asked for anything in return. My mother wishes me to tell you that she already knew you would want to go, and that she has arranged for your absence from the Red Antler to cost you nothing. She is, as I have learned not to argue with, usually right about these things." Cassie and Hazel read it twice. Then she stood on the step of the Red Antler, in the cold December morning with the letter in her hands and the broom still leaning against her leg, and she pressed her lips together very hard, and she breathed. Owen. His name in ink. In a stranger's handwriting, more real than it had been in 3 years of silence. She looked up at the rider. "Tell him yes," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. The escort arrived the following morning. 4 guards, a horse for Hazel, and a covered cart for the few things she brought with her, which were not many. Aldrich stood at the tavern door and watched her go with an expression she had not expected. Not the relief of a man losing a servant, but something more complicated. Something that looked, around the edges, like pride. "You were always too good for this place," he said, which was the most he had ever said to her at once. "You gave me a place when I needed one," she answered. "I won't forget that." He waved her off with the gruff impatience of a man who did not want to be thanked, and she went. The road north through the gray wood was cold and long and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when you are moving toward something rather than away from it. They rode for 2 days. On the morning of the 3rd day, they came down out of the trees into a valley where a small village sat beside a frozen river, its rooftops white with snow, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys in pale columns against a sky that was, for the first time in days, entirely clear and blue. Thornwall. Hazel saw him before he saw her. He was standing outside a low stone building at the edge of the village, taller than she remembered, broader in the shoulder, his hair darker than it had been at 14 when she had last seen his face. He was speaking with an older woman, gesturing at something on the building's wall, and he was laughing at something she said, and the laugh was so completely, unmistakably his, that Hazel felt it hit her somewhere beneath the ribs like a physical thing. She dismounted before the horse had fully stopped. He turned at the sound of the hooves. He looked at her. And for a moment, one long, suspended moment, neither of them moved, because the mind takes longer than the heart to accept the things it has spent years being afraid to hope for. Then he crossed the distance between them in 4 strides, and she met him halfway, and they held on to each other in the snow outside a stranger's house in a village at the edge of the world. And Hazel did not try to keep her voice steady this time, because there was no one she needed to be steady for. She wept. He did too, though he would later deny it. "I looked for you," he said into her hair. He was 21 now, her little brother, and his voice had dropped an entire register since she had last heard it. "I looked everywhere." "I know," she said. "I'm here. I'm here now." They stayed in Thornwall for 3 days, given a room in the healer's house by a kind woman named Berta, who asked no questions and provided an extraordinary quantity of food. Hazel and Owen talked until their voices gave out, and then talked more, filling in the 3 years of silence piece by piece. What had happened to him on the road, how he had been found, how the healer's family had taken him in, what had happened to her, the long months of grief and displacement that had ended in Ashfin, in a smoky tavern, in 3 years of making herself useful and trying not to want more than that. On the 2nd evening, a second rider arrived from the north, carrying a brief message that informed Hazel the royal procession had returned from the northern shrine and would pass through Thornwall on its southward journey in 2 days' time. She read the message alone, by the fire. Then she read it again. Owen, watching her from across the room with the particular perception of a younger sibling who has always paid close attention to his older sister's face, said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Who is it from?" "The king," she said. Owen was quiet. "The king," he repeated. "It's not—" She stopped, started again. "He's the one who found you, who sent the rider to Ashfin." She folded the message carefully. "I owe him a great deal." "That's not quite the face a person makes about a debt," Owen said. She threw a piece of bread at him. He caught it and ate it, grinning, and she looked back at the fire and tried to organize her expression into something less legible. The procession arrived on the 4th morning. Hazel stood at the edge of the village road with Owen beside her, and she watched the column come down through the valley. The outriders first, then the guards, then the litter, then Cassian at the rear, which surprised her, until she understood that he had ridden behind to keep watch on what followed, rather than what lay ahead. A small detail, the kind of detail she was beginning to recognize as characteristic. He saw her immediately. She thought he had probably been looking. He dismounted and walked to where she stood, and the formality of it, the guards, the procession, the full weight of what he was, pressed against the small, fire-lit memory of a corner in a tavern where he had been almost simply a man, and the contrast was enough to make her want to take a step back. She did not. He stopped before her. His eyes moved briefly to Owen, taking him in with a single assessing look, and then returned to her. "You came," he said. "You found my brother," she said. "There was no world in which I wasn't going to come." He was quiet for a moment. "And now that you have him, what will you do?" It was the question she had been turning over for 3 days. Owen was settled here, or could be. Berta's family had made clear he was welcome to remain as long as he wished. But Hazel had no such anchor. Ashfen was behind her, and the life she had made there had always been the life of a woman waiting without knowing she was waiting. She looked at Cassian. She thought about his mother, signing across a firelit corner. The loneliest thing is being surrounded by people who don't try to listen. She thought about a man who had learned a language in secret so that his mother would not disappear from rooms. She thought about what it meant to be seen. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I think—" She paused. "I think I am done making myself small enough to fit the space I'm given. I would like, for once, to find out what space I actually take up." Something shifted in his expression. Not the unfinished question this time. Something that had resolved, quietly, into something else. "There is a position," he said, "at the court in Donmere. My mother requires a companion who can speak with her as you do. Someone who will not treat her silence as absence." He held her gaze. "I will not pretend that is the only reason I am asking." The wind moved through the valley. Somewhere behind him, Hazel could see the green curtain of the litter shift, and a pale hand appear briefly and form a single sign before withdrawing. "Say yes." Hazel looked at Cassian. She thought about 3 years of learning to need very little, and what it felt like to stand in a frozen village and want something clearly, without apology, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember. "Yes," she said. In the years that followed, the court of Donmere changed in ways that were small and visible only to those who paid close attention, which, at court, were fewer people than one might hope, but more than enough. Seraphine no longer disappeared from rooms. She sat at the high table at feasts and spoke with her hands, and Hazel translated when needed, and did not translate when it was not. And gradually the court learned to look at the Queen Mother when she had something to say, rather than around her. Owen came south in the spring. He apprenticed with the royal healers. Berta had taught him more than Hazel had known. And he had, within a year, made himself as quietly indispensable as his sister had always been, though with somewhat less restraint about letting people know it. And Cassian, who had spent years being a man that rooms rearranged themselves around, who had worn his stillness like armor against a world that expected him to be without fracture, learned, slowly, and not without difficulty, that there was a difference between being alone and being protected, and that the woman who had not flinched in front of a drunk man in a tavern was equally disinclined to let him disappear behind his own composure when she could see him doing it. He learned, in short, to be seen, and found that it cost him less than he had always feared. On a morning in early spring, in the stone courtyard where the Donmere Keep opened onto a garden that was just beginning to consider returning to life, he signed something to his mother, and then turned and said it aloud to Hazel, who was standing 3 feet away, and had read his hands before his mouth had finished forming the words. She answered before he was done. He looked at her. "You already knew what I was going to say," he said. "I'm very observant," she said. "I've noticed." The courtyard was quiet around them. Somewhere inside the keep, Owen was almost certainly talking too much to someone who deserved a break from it, and Seraphine was almost certainly watching all of this from a window above, and had been for longer than either of them would ever quite confirm. Hazel looked at the garden. She looked at the man beside her. She thought about a smoky tavern in Ashvin, and a fire that had been dying, and the way she had added 2 logs without anyone asking her to, because she had always been the person who noticed what needed tending. She thought that she had finally found something worth tending that would also tend her back. That was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was everything.